Ravi Sundar, thanks for coming on the show. Sundar, can we start off by just giving people an overview of the Cisco case? People may not have heard of it, and give people an overview, refresh their memory, and where are we now?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for having us on the show. Quick backstory: I'm a tech entrepreneur for the last 27 more plus years in Silicon Valley. More white hair than I'm letting on. Um, I started a company in 2015, which was a Cisco spin-in. So Cisco had funded us completely, entirely to build this company to model data center networks. And in that spin-in, we'd hired, and I'd personally hired a batchmate of mine, who is called John Doe for the purpose of the case. His name is now no longer anonymous, but he filed a lawsuit alleging caste discrimination. Now, John Doe was a batchmate of mine, whom I'd known from my undergraduate days back at IIT Bombay. And so he filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination, retaliation, and harassment, all three, with the California Civil Rights Department. The California Civil Rights Department, also known as the CRD, is a central place where employment lawsuits are sent to, disputes are sent to. And in this case, the CRD personally got involved and filed a lawsuit both on behalf of John Doe and themselves, alleging all three causes of action: discrimination, retaliation, and caste-based harassment. This happened, the incidents began in late 2016, and the lawsuit was filed in June of 2020.
So, Ravi, then, how did you get involved in this? And just give the people that you're the producer, one of the producers of the film. How did this come about?
Oh, well, I was going about my merry way as usual. This is not my area of expertise or even interest, normally speaking. But about 10 odd years ago, I was invited by the California Board of Education to serve as a subject matter expert in the textbook adoption process for K to 12 social studies. And that exposed me to a maelstrom of, in a sense, political mobilization across different ideological divides. Since then, I had a bit of an antenna sort of tweaked to kind of just look for news items and sort of track these kinds of things. And when the Cisco case came about, it's something I started following. Although, I couldn't take sides. I didn't know the facts. I wasn't sure what was going on. So I just kind of was neutral. But when it began to get resolved towards the end, in Sundar's favor, I felt that I needed to know more about this out of curiosity. And the more I dug in, the more appalled I was that such a thing could have happened. And so it's at that moment that I felt, as an academic, that these kinds of things need to be documented. And that's how I began the process of conceiving this film.
So give it to people. You said this isn't your normal job. What is your background then? People won't know.
Well, I'm a professor of environmental studies, for the most part, working on environmental policy issues.
Oh, got it. Okay. Well, then give us, either one of you can jump in. How did the film come about? And give it people the behind the scenes of that. What was the impetus? Who's involved? And that sort of thing.
Well, when I got this idea, the key thing was to storyboard it and see if anything makes sense. So I started contacting people around me who A, knew how to make films, and B, who knew about the content matter, who had been in the community out there doing the advocacy work as well. And with that, I started reading on my own as well, and I put together a kind of a brief storyboard. And I think at some point down the line, I met people who could finance this. I also met Sundar at that time, asked him for consent, or that he'd be willing to be interviewed for this. And when all the stars aligned, so to speak, we decided to go on. We then did a kind of an international search for a director, interviewed a bunch of people, and landed up on Vikram Mishra, who turned out to be great.
And Sundar, what was your experience being in the film and airing it in that way?
Yeah. The way I saw it is, well, the film is primarily an exposition of truth. And what's actually more interesting than the truth is it's an expostulation of fact. And I was very happy when Ravi approached us for a very simple reason that I like the style which Ravi took. Ravi, being a professor, is a stickler for information and fact. And the whole documentary was created as a treatise to let people know the truth of what's happened and what's happening, and several other egregious aspects of the case, especially on behalf of a state agency. So I like the fact that Ravi was, collecting all of information, reading public documents, court documents, and wanted to ensure that this is not a movie made in the so-called masala factor of entertainment. It's made to document the truth, but more importantly, with a very simple purpose, which is to tell both our current and future generations what's going on behind the scenes, and especially from a government agency.
It's that you mentioned some of the behind the scenes aspects of that. And at HAF, I was aware of the case for some time, obviously. But what really got to me was some of the publicly available information that was ignored. And who would like to go into that? Because as an interviewer, I know it, but I think it would be better in one of your voices, specifically some of the depositions and some of your background that was grossly misrepresented by the state.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with some facts. In fact, I'd like to mention things that are even beyond depositions, but just statement of facts that were known to the Civil Rights Department. And I'll put these in different genres, if you will, right? This might be a long soliloquy, but just to give you a little bit of color on different things, you first have basic statements which are just purely false. For example, Mr. Iyer ran a group of entirely Indians. Uh, they know it for a fact. They have the HR records. I mean, this was a fairly broad group, and we had people from different ethnicities, languages, and different countries. And there was a point at which almost 15+% of the group was Romanian, because we had outsourced an entire team into Romania, and of course several other folks. It was just a direct lie, if you will. Pepper that with statements which were one-way acerbic statements, like Indian Americans bring their casteist attitudes. Now, that's terrible for a state agency to come up with, general subjective statements like that. That is then peppered with a broad set of narratives about caste-based violence in California that has zero statement in record or fact. So I'm starting with statements that are purely one-way statements that are verifiably false, right? And publicly verifiably to be false. You then take that to the next level of statements that are constitutional violations. For example, they assigned me both a religion and a caste. They basically said that being a Brahmin is part of the central tenets of Hinduism. And when they interviewed me, knowing fully well that I'm irreligious, not only that, they have public records of my irreligion, right? So that's just a direct one-way constitutional violation, which is then peppered with statements about Hindu Americans and Indian Americans, all one way. Here's the word salad. Dominant caste Indian Americans and managers are dominant, hostile, oppressive, bigoted, cable, tribal, what have you. These are all words used by the Californian Civil Rights Department, right? So as we build the narrative of pain, or the pyramid of pain, if you will, I'm just giving you examples of statements that are one-way statements and purely false. These are then laid upon claims that are legally so untenable and unethical. For example, John Doe was paid something of the order of $4.5 million in equity, because I, as the CEO of the company, took no equity at all. I had given away 100% of my equity to my employees. And the state claimed that John Doe was making low pay, when me, the CEO, was making far less in compensation than him, because he walked away with millions. Trying to capture a $5,000 salary increase that John Doe was not given, and causing an opprobrium of low pay. It's that level of absolutely unethical data, right? Are you allowed to legally make a claim of low pay? Maybe. But as a state agency, do you get to hide all of this information to make a claim? That's, gut wrenching to say the least. And I'll pepper more over as we get into the rest of the podcast. But these are the levels of both direct and outright lying of facts, along with one-way statements that are extremely egregious, to say the least. And I've given you probably about 7 facts out of more than 110 egregious actions of this so-called civil rights agency.
Yeah. Ravi, what do you have to add on that?
Well, clearly, this was a fairly motivated exercise. It seems to me that the the nonprofit entities, some of their collaborators, both within and outside the establishment, including academia, private philanthropy, probably some political entities as well, had very much planned this. And they just landed on Sundar's case. Those details of how they actually jumped onto Sundar is something that we yet don't exactly know. We don't know the connections between Chetan, Narsode, and these organizations. But that there's been some degree of connivance and a very careful, uh, carefully planned thing to use a case, Sundar. It doesn't really matter what the collateral damage to the clearly innocent individual is, but to be able to get at some broader ideological agendas against, in this particular case, the Hindu American community. We can only guess about why that happened.
You mentioned some organizations and interests there. Who would like to go into those? Again, might be the type of thing that some That's So Hindu listeners are aware of, but we can't pitch it for people in the know. What can you be more specific on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the film, we were, my focus entirely was on the documentation of the facts as they were, clearly materially presented. But one can see and speculate. So what I'm going to say right now are a couple of points of speculation, not necessarily corroborated by exact data. So with that caveat, I think there are a couple of things going on here. One is clearly that there is a very strong anti-Hindutva narrative that is centered around Indian politics, which is being transposed onto the United States. And there are many, many entities, including opposition parties in India and so on. Or in other words, there's a concerted attempt here to take an Indian issue and juxtapose it on an American context, even though the contexts weren't relevant. Clearly, they were religious entities with very, very clearly anti-Hindu sort of frameworks. You can see it by the ideologies, the frameworks they espouse, et cetera, which are, to put it very simply, hate speech and nothing else. And if you see the film, it becomes quite obvious what's going on here. What struck me was the parallels in the nature of the communications, the actual speech acts and the and the kinds of statements that were getting made between the nonprofit protagonists here, Tenmuri Soundarajan and company, and the kinds of things that we're seeing, for example, in South India, for example, where similarly Hindu Indians are being targeted by these kinds of communities that seek to undermine them. Even yesterday, we had a case that blew up in another state in which in this particular case, a Christian, political leader admonished Hindus as worshippers of false gods. So, it's it's important to say, of course, is the vast majority of Christians traditionally in India very well, amalgamated, and we work together very, very well. But this is a particularly new thing. I mean, this is an attempt at trying to build a divide that has never existed in society. And to me, as a secular person, again, not as somebody who came into this very religious at all, it's this kind of desecularization that I wanted to push back on because it'll tear up society as I see it.
Sundar, thoughts on that? I mean, especially because, as you say, I'm not religious. I mean, how do you identify? Did you call yourself an atheist, not religious? What? It's a
Yeah, I mean,
it's vague.
I've pretty much always been irreligious all my life. And the way I put it succinctly is, if the world had a creator, that's a beautiful thing. If this entire universe and where we got to happened without a creator, that is an equally beautiful thing. So in both parts, I'm agnostic to which of these two are true. But just to talk on beliefs, if there was a creator, why is there evil is still an unresolved action item, assuming the creator is omnipotent and omnipresent. But we'll leave that for another day. But adding to what Ravi said, and Ravi, I assume, was very conservatively using the word speculation. I want to go a bit beyond that. There are aspects of what the Civil Rights Department has put in their documents that has directly imported an Indian framework. In fact, what's egregious is they use caste violence statistics in India, which use Government of India statistics on crimes against Dalit Americans in India. Now, researcher after researcher, including the Ministry of Home Affairs in India, has put out that the statistics on crimes cannot be interpreted the way they could be abused for many, many reasons, simply because most caste crimes in India, um, they assume, for example, alleged crimes are considered as crimes. Crimes that are shown to be untrue are still in the database. Crimes where the caste of the perpetrator is not known is still alleged to be an upper caste perpetrator. Crimes that the concept of what is considered as a violent crime has now grown to things which are way beyond what is considered to be criminally violent. There are aspects where the government does not collect data of crimes against the upper caste or the middle caste. So you do not know what the baseline is. There are several statistical irregularities, but here's the rub. There's been papers published, and anecdotal data shows that upper caste Indian Americans do not commit more crimes on Dalit Americans than the national average. In fact, you would argue that data actually suggests otherwise. And anecdotal data on Brahmins, the so-called upper caste, shows almost uh, a lack of Brahmins being associated with violent crimes on Dalit Americans. But keeping all that aside, the state of California very well knows the abuse of their statistics. In fact, they claim to be, statistical savoyards, if you will, by even talking about, p-values and stuff in their complaint. I'm like, if you are so smart to understand statistics, then how do you use Indian data directly in an egregious manner, and especially given the fact that the government of India has put out more than 15 to 20 communiques over the last 30 years, telling people to not abuse the data because the caste crime data is not what you think it is, right? So, just to add color to what Ravi said, it is beyond speculation that they were trying to import a so-called Indian context, which is still steeped in falsity and statistical nonsense, but they imported it directly. There were more than 700 pages of documentation filed by the Civil Rights Department, a lot of which refer to Indian data and statistics. Right.
Ravi, anything on that?
No, he's absolutely right. I mean, when I talked about speculation, I was referring simply to the role of extraneous entities, the religious conversion guys, anti-Hindu zealots, things like that, for which we don't have concrete proof. But I'm sure if a good journalist were to go and try and, sort of research this, they will probably find some really interesting information. In fact, it speaks a lot about the nature of our society that this kind of reportage does not take place.
Yeah, it's the lack of reportage. I gave many journalists, when I learned of some of the deposition materials and some of the background of, well, I knew the background, but shared the background of some of these groups involved with journalists. I went through meticulously everybody who wrote about this, and I gave it to them. I said, look at this is what's going on. Not one of them wrote about it at all. It was not something anybody was interested in. I mean, and to editorialize about it, it felt like to me that they wanted the story to keep going with how they first saw it, and anything that went against that they wanted nothing to do with. And I'll just leave it there. It's highly infuriating. But let's go back to the film a little bit. what's the plan? How has the reception been so far? Where has it been shown? That sort of thing. What's the community reception in particular? Either one of you.
Yeah, I mean, we've the plan. We did consult people who know better than us. I'm not a filmmaker. This is my first film, and the advice we were given is to try and go to festivals first. And I, as an academic, took it as a kind of a peer review type process, in that there's a certain kind of expert sussing, if you will, of the quality of the thing. And then the idea was that once the cycle of festivals is exhausted, which is in another 3 or 4 months, I believe, then it could indeed go public. And the plan for us is twofold. We've been very lucky so far in that we've had very, very positive reviews. For example, India Today just last week published an excellent article, which really got into the meat of what the film was actually about, which was actually good to see in the mainstream media. We've also won quite a few awards, so including Best Documentary. So that's been very encouraging as well. But down the line, the goal is twofold. Once we're allowed to, once we go past this festival business, there are going to be two things we'll do. One is we're going to give the film for free to Hindu advocacy organizations for their own messaging, because this is important documentation. There's really nothing speculative about it. There's nothing hyperbolic about it. It's very dry and tells the story. So we're going to give it to organizations to use it in their own outreach and public education efforts. The second objective is to try and engage with leading policymakers, politicians, probably journalists, police departments, things like that. People who interface with the American public to educate them about the fact that these kinds of political shenanigans exist within American society, and to be aware of it.
Sundar, anything to add on that? Hey, have you? I realize I don't know this. Bad researcher on me. Have you been at any of the screenings? How has it been seeing the reaction to your story, basically?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I would like to thank Ravi Rajan again for just documenting and sticking to the truth, including the director Vikram Mishra, who made it upon themselves to both, create a documentary that is fairly diverse. The number of people that have been interviewed is fairly big, and it goes beyond the Cisco case into, of course, SB 403, and exactly the same shenanigans and data that was used to try to push a narrative, if you will. I've definitely attended a few of the early screenings. It's been wonderful to see that at least people who watch the film get a sort of unbiased and objective view to what's going on. So that's been nice. It's also good to see the film won a bunch of awards, mainly, and that shouldn't be surprising given the clarity and candor with which the documentary was produced. Of course, we'd like to see a lot more. As Ravi likes to call it, this is an artifact to put information out there. Now it's important to share this artifact with as many people so that we can create real change. In my mind, the reason I spend time, in helping and getting interviewed and more is to ensure that what happened to me is currently passé. That's life. It's unfortunate. I would like this moment, as well as everything that happened in California, to be an awakening moment to Hindu Indian Americans, and for that matter, leaving the ethnic moniker out, any well-thinking, rational, like-minded American who wants good for this country, to understand what's going on. Of course, no different from the attacks that happen in Jewish Americans, to say the least, or white Americans for that matter, or any hardworking American of any ethnicity. And so that we can eventually have a movement to take back the country from forces of evil. So to me, this is just a journey, and it's a lifelong journey. I realize we've all lived in a cocoon, including myself in Silicon Valley. And it's a moment to say we've got to give back, and we've got to fight the good fight. Right.
Ravi, it's occurring to me. Have you seen any pushback against what's being said?
Let's
I don't know.
I believe because it's not been in the public domain yet, all it's really done is around some of the festivals. It hasn't really been seen yet. So I'm quite sure we'll get pushback when it happens. But the good thing about this is that I welcome the pushback because this film is completely documentary. It documents facts. There's very little, in fact, no speculation at all. So I'd say bring it on. I mean, let's talk about facts for a change.
Facts is a good segue. Sundar, you mentioned before many errors in the case, and I want to give you the chance. What do you see as the most egregious ones? If you had to pick two or three, and set the record straight on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many, but I'll try and pick a couple more than what we've started with. So let's start with the harassment claims. Now, for the viewers, harassment in a law means that a manager did something that was personally egregious. You call somebody the N-word, for example, would be harassment. You did something where you bullied somebody repeatedly, blah blah blah, would be harassment. And harassment claims are personal; they're on the manager, they're not on the company, right? So when a state files a harassment claim, you've got to ask, geez, what did these managers do to be cause for harassment? So let me start with the claim on Ramana Kompella, who was the other defendant named in the case. The state claims that Ramana Kompella asked John Doe to file weekly status reports. That, in the state's mind, is harassment. Not only is that egregious on its own, it's egregious for a few other reasons. It was well documented that John Doe was not performing and not even coming into work. And so Ramana Kompella had every reason, documented reason, to request weekly status reports. What is even worse is the state is aware that that order was given by Ramana Kompella's white manager, who was the chief technology officer of the business unit, right? So you have in this case Ramana, an Indian American, following the diktats of his manager, requesting John Doe to at least give weekly status reports. That, in the state's mind, is harassment. Now, let me paraphrase this. This should cause a chill into every manager in California, irrespective of their ethnicity. If you cannot do your bloody job, and the state can willy-nilly call that harassment, then what can you do? Right? So that's one example of something extremely egregious. Now, let's take this one notch further. Since you asked for more examples, the state claims, and one of the claims against me and Ramana for harassment is that John Doe was isolated, right? Isolation, asking someone to, cutting them off completely from social contact could be considered harassment. Well, what are the facts? And the state has full knowledge of this. And we say that in the documentary too. John Doe was asked which group would he like to join. There were two groups in the startup for the engineering portion, because we divided them into two individually functioning groups. John Doe refuses to join any one of those groups, right? When we ask him, John Doe, would you like to work with a particular manager? He refuses that overture. We give him a specific manager. He refuses that. Then we ask John Doe, would you like to work with any lead, right, as a technical lead and work with him? He refuses that. These are all overtures on written email. Several months later, we asked John Doe, as we're doing an engineering reorganization, would you like to name your manager you want to work for? He refuses that overture. Every option we've had to ask John Doe to come into work, to work with any particular individual, he refuses. And the state claims that John Doe has been isolated.
If you want, sorry to interrupt, but you're giving all these facts that, and I knew these as it was happening, when I became public. Do you think it was a setup? It feels to me, based on hearing that coming out of your mouth again, that somebody, I want to be careful legally here. I don't want to be, have somebody. It sounds like somebody. It sounds like it could be a setup.
But that's the conclusion that Vikram and I came to. I mean, both of us came into this story cold. I mean, we really didn't have much. And going into this, there were interesting concepts here, but The proof really lay in the materials that we looked at. We looked at it very, very carefully. And, we've got a nonprofit organization and a charismatic leader badmouthing all of Hindu Americans. We've got a bunch of other people also badmouthing Hindu Americans, including academics, members of the media, etc., more or less saying the same thing. Then you've got this case in which we have, the state with whom there has been prior association that's been emerged in the papers in terms of, we record that in the film, in terms of people kind of being, sort of being, okay, in terms of people okay, so we see coincidences. Yeah. So, we definitely saw, and we recorded in the film, the fact that there were all these entities which it clearly were visible in the same frame and pictures, who were citing each other, etc., etc. For example, the court filings by the state, California, the agency does mention the nonprofit which has been leading the charge, if you will, both on the Cisco case as well as the SB 403, as well as the wider anti Hindu American thing. So, given that, there's a heck of a lot of coincidence here. Now, admittedly, coincidence is not causation, but I think the absence of causation simply points to me, is simply the fact that no one's really bothered to look at this carefully, rather than lack of an actual causal entity itself.
Yeah.
Funding there.
This is all happening against the background of SB 403, and you go into it in the film. But politics and legislation moves fast. Can one of you just remind listeners what SB 403 was, what happened for that? Obviously, at HAF, we were intimately involved in that. But it'd be, again, as I said before, it'd probably be better coming out of one of your voices. And I'd like to hear your perspective, just as somebody who wasn't involved in the advocacy side of it. What SB 403, what was it, and your take? Either one can go. Yeah.
Broader history to this, beginning with the whole textbook thing, where I did see close to 15 years ago a very careful attempt at trying to malign members of the Hindu community, sort of particularly putting them out as a separate case of malevolent entities who are culturally and religiously structured to discriminate. So this kind of narrative had come about, was being established, and had been established 15 years ago. It was visible all over the entire textbook debate that took place. And subsequently, the SB 403, as I saw it, was an attempt at trying to, in a sense, raise public, kind of make a big show in public, like a show trial. I mean, the Sundar Iyer case, to me, frankly, when I looked at it from my vantage point, was like the American equivalent of the Dreyfus affair. The French thing that happened in the late 19th century, where a honorable public servant was roasted alive and even sent to die in a remote part of the world. And in this particular case, and there, of course, one saw a wider undertone against Jewish French people. It's very similar here. You've got a charismatic, highly accomplished public, person, in this case, Sundar Iyer, who then literally gets banished in this way. And then by definition, then that case is used to malign the community. So there wasn't anything there, as I saw it, in terms of an actual material case to make an argument that there needs to be a recognition of caste, for example, in California politics, which is what SB 403, as I saw it, was trying to advocate. Instead, it was taking a bully pulpit with a big, large megaphone and communicating and shouting out to the entire world that, look, here's a community that discriminates, and here's Exhibit A.
Sundar, your take on SB 403. I mean, it seems obvious to me that there are parallels in the way the state, where that legislation was put forward, and some of the wording in the state's case against you. That there are parallels to things that you were saying before about Indian politics and bringing an Indian approach to dealing with caste issues to the United States. Am I on the mark on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And just for the edification of your viewers, of course, SB 403 was an attempt to explicitly mention that caste discrimination is legally banned in California. As with every far left talking point, sounds like a great idea. Here's the rub with that. Any form of discrimination based on ancestry or religious or whatever identity is already banned based on facially neutral characteristics. If you wanted to put something in anti-discrimination law, it has to be facially neutral. Now, wink, wink, nod, nod, the attempt to make the word caste facially neutral was what these folks tried to do, while egregiously calling out South Asia and India in particular, and Hindu Americans in particular, as perpetrators of caste discrimination. So you have 700 to 1,000 pages of document calling caste as an Indian facet, calling out the country and its people directly. And this is done by the great Ayesha Wahab, the state senator, and her co-conspirator, Jasmeet Bains, with zero ethical nuance of what they did. They know what they are doing. After that, they attempted to pretend as if the word caste is facially neutral. And of course, the statistics that they put, the data on caste crimes, etc., were exactly the same used as a playbook from the Cisco case, knowing fully well that the data, for example, here's a statistic they use in SB 403, that something of the order of 10,000 Dalit Americans have been physically assaulted or raped in America based on not only a phony and terribly done web survey, but leaving all that aside, there's not a single case of reported caste violence in America. Knowing all of this, knowing that the judge had thrown these, information out in the Cisco case, and it doesn't need a judge to throw it out, it just needs a rational, ethical person to know that this data is false. Both Jasmeet Bains and the great, wonderful Senator Aisha Wahab both decided to carry on their soliloquy and hate of Indian Americans. That is SB 403 in a nutshell. Pushed by a progressive agenda to get this through the Senate as well as the Assembly.
To interject there, for viewers, facially neutral in this context, in a legal context, it's a class that can apply to everyone. Everyone has, I was about to say everyone has gender, but let's use that in a generic sense rather than in a gender theory sense. That's a different debate. Everybody identifies as a gender. Everybody has ethnicity. Everybody has religion. Even if you have none, that still counts in it. It applies to everyone equally, whereas not everybody in the world identifies by any of the categories that can be called caste. So that's the facially neutral part. Sundar, I know you, in talking, you wanted to comment on some of the politicians involved in this. Obviously, in SB 403, Governor Newsom vetoed it and agreed that alleged caste discrimination can be covered by facially neutral categories that already exist. I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about that a little.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, to me, the egregious part about SB 403 is keeping aside the politics of it. I've personally talked to politicians, Ash Kalra, for example, the day before the vote in the Assembly Judiciary Committee. And here is what we always told Ash, which is we're not telling you how to vote. That is not my, prerogative, to say the least. We're asking you to ask ethical questions. Where are the tens and thousands of rapes of Dalit Americans in California? And it is a singular question I've asked several legislatures, unfortunately, most of them in the Progressive Democratic Party. And the answers that they gave were everything from ignorance, purposely, refusing to answer or take calls, a direct sort of fly in the face, which I remember saying, Mr. Iyer, our standards in legislature are less than that are used in the judiciary. And I remember asking, saying, Mr. Legislature, are you telling me that if somebody said tens and thousands of assaults have been committed by Hindu and Indian Americans in California, you're ready to take that on face value with zero knowledge of fact or zero proof? That to me is egregious and shocking, and it shows you the level of corruption that has reached this party. And I don't mean to make this a political thing. It is extremely sad to me that you have leaders who are not even ethical. You may play politics in any which way you want, but if you cannot stand up for ethics, you have no party and you have no country. So the what I saw with SB 403 is not really about caste or Indian Americans. And it's not even about these activists or left-wing academics or all the, mainstream media crap that they do because they're private agencies. It is that you have leaders who are afraid of standing up for ethics simply because they want to stay in the party and continue being voted in, right? And that is a sad day for America.
Ravi, anything on the political aspect of that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not privy to the actual conversations with the politicians concerned, but it boggles my mind that a legislator would actually put their signature, their imprimatur, on a bill without really verifying the facts. But more critically, when the facts have been given to them, there's a contrary body of very credible evidence presented in front of them that they willy-nilly choose to ignore it. The question is why? Why did that occur? Once again, I'm an academic, so I don't like to necessarily go without evidence, but nevertheless, I'd ask the question of why did it take place? I mean, why would you do such a thing, given that the evidence points in exactly the contrary direction to the legislation that you're actually presenting? Is there is there corruption? So my question, I wouldn't assert that there is corruption because I don't know, but I'd like to know. I mean, what was the exact compact that you are a part of that resulted you to vote and act and speak in the way in which you did?
Thank you for that, Ravi. Let's go back to the film and bring this interview to a close here. Where can people see it? What's the next step for this? And outside of a festival setting, can anybody watch this now, or will they have to wait a few months? What's going on?
I encourage people to do two things. One is to bookmark our URL, which is www.castegatethefilm, one word, .org, castegatethefilm.org. And in it, there's also a link to a YouTube channel where we are putting various kinds of things. We just uploaded an hour and a half interview that I did in a studio with two leading academics, carefully dissecting every major premise concerning the underlying narrative by the state in this particular case, going back to broader history. So, and there's much more that's being uploaded in the coming months. So there's enough to keep you engaged and entertained up until the point that the film is will be released. So you can definitely follow us on the webpage. We're also on the socials, so Instagram and other places. We do have a presence. So we will announce the film the moment it goes public and is ready to stream.
Okay, so are there any festival screenings or anything coming up, or no? Or are you done with that and we're sort of in an in-between period?
I think we're in between right now because of the December period. It'll resume again in January.
Okay.
We had a big one in Dallas recently.
Sundar, anything you want to leave people with here? Anything we haven't talked about? I should put that back to Ravi too. Sundar first. Anything to close this out with?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One is, of course, the film website is fantastic. There is another sister site called Castegate.org, which simply captures all the court documents and motions, and is a pretty good repository of data and facts that people are encouraged to read so that they understand the truth on their own. I would say two calls for action, if you will. The film itself is still in need of additional donations to pay key folks and personnel who have worked, and we encourage folks to help in that cause. All of this cause is for a social purpose, and it's beyond Hindu and Indian Americans. It is to eventually make a better America. So, and for listeners, write to us. You're welcome to write to us personally and help us in this journey. We are looking for like-minded people eventually to do good for this country. It's not about the movie or cast or any specific topic. It's how do we get good people together and make a difference? In my mind, the single focused thing we need to do is to begin an investigation of the Civil Rights Department. The moment we find one ethical politician with the backbone to do this, that'll be a wonderful day. We do have a few who are interested in bringing a motion into the California either Assembly or Senate next year, Jan of 2026. And I hope that motion can then lead the first effort in beginning an investigation into a government-sponsored agency. It's not about private actors, but this is a government-sponsored, your taxpayer money being used for ridiculous and egregious purposes.
I was going to say great, but that's a weird thing to say after all that. That's a bit of a heavy statement there. You mentioned people donating. Can they do that on which one of those websites can people do that, or how should that be done?
To the main website, castegate.thefilm.org, there is a Donate Now portal out there,
Excellent.
which if you click on, get to GoFundMe.
Okay. Great. Ravi, I'll leave it with you. Any final closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think that we focused a lot in this podcast on the state's, issues. But it's to me, it's beyond doubt that we are at a moment in which there is a concerted, fairly organized campaign against people of the Hindu faith in the American community, regardless of what their ethnicity might be as well. So Hindus are not necessarily just Indians; they come from all backgrounds. In the modern world, at least, there are many people like that. So this is very much a concerted campaign against Hindu Americans writ large. It is not trivial by any means. Children are the curricula being impacted. Children are being harassed in schools, in universities, and so on, made to feel really bad. There are some institutions that are actually conniving in this at the level of institutions of higher education. This is as serious as hate, hate work against any other community in this country. And all of us as Americans must take this seriously. It concerns all of us. You don't have to be a part of one particular ethnicity in order to take this seriously. We are in this together. So I think that's the important message I would drive home. And I think the reason, again, I want to reinforce at the end the call for donations, because one of the key steps forward, having made the film, is to get it out there. We've got to have the politicians. I think that, generally speaking, having lived in this country for almost 40 years now, the average American is a very kind, compassionate, and considerate, and fairly rational and equanimous person. So I think if we leave it to the average American to decide, we'll actually get very reasonable and fair outcomes. So the key here is to actually get the information across to leading politicians, to others as well, so that they can make up their minds. And that's the reason why we need the funds right now, to be able to do these congressional hearings, to show the film in multiple contexts, etc. So we do need your support. The campaign is not done with the film. We do need your support, and we are obviously working and will work with every major organization that's interested in supporting the righteous cause, which means treating all religions, everybody fairly. One final point, even though the film is called Cascade, this film is not about caste. We unequivocally state at the outset and through the film that we are against all forms of discrimination, including caste. This is really about using caste to go after, in this particular case, Indo-Americans. So Castegate, in that sense, it's not about caste violence in that direct sense, but about using and misusing caste to target an entire American community.
Very well said. Thank you both for joining me. For viewers, I will put the links that were mentioned in the description. There's a trailer, I believe, up there, and a link to Ravi, your interview yesterday, which I watched part of, which I believe included Prakash Shah. He was an early guest on this show. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a good day.